Welcome to Lecture 2 on how your brain changes. Now that we've learned something about how your brain is organized, let's talk about how changes in your brain can improve the way you function in day-to-day life. For instance, intelligence. Traditionally, we considered intelligence to be fixed and unmodifiable, something we were born with, like eye color. Now comes a revolutionary transformation in our thinking. Intelligence is not a fixed trait that can be modified over a lifetime. It changes as our brains change. I'm referring to the findings of James Flynn, an intelligence researcher at the University of Otago in Dunedin, New Zealand. Flynn demonstrated that from 1947 to 2002, Americans gained 24 points on IQ tests for similarities, but only 4 points on vocabulary and 2 points on math. Why such a gain only in similarities? That's because we're using our intelligence in different ways. Now we have more education, more leisure activities, and in the process we've altered the balance between the abstract and the concrete. In agrarian and hunter societies over hundreds of years, intelligence was practical and literal, talking about growth and talking about animals and trails and things like that. But thanks to urbanization, education, and the permeation of scientific thinking into our everyday lives, we can now move beyond thinking only about the here and now. We can actually work with concepts that involve abstraction. Intelligence today involves the ability to think outside the bounds of personal observation and experience. Proverbs are good examples of this. A rolling stone gathers no moss. It's really not about stones, about moss. It's about the fact that one has to keep moving along in order to prosper and do well. A stitch in time saves nine is not about stitches or time or nine. It's about taking precautions to make sure bad things don't happen. People in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. It means that you shouldn't criticize people for things that actually refer to yourself as well. Now here's a hard one you can think about yourself in your own time. The tongue is the enemy of the neck. Now, how did this change come about from literal, experience-based thinking to abstract thinking? Let's discover and discuss whether it can be entirely explained by genetics. Flynn thought that genetic changes could not account for the increase. There simply isn't enough time. Instead, intelligence is related to cultural forces, and it can change in tandem with these changes. Now, this deals a death blow to the theory that our cognitive powers are dependent on genetic factors alone. For one thing, twin studies favoring genetics are flawed. And Flynn uses an interesting analogy taken from basketball. Imagine two twins separated at birth, tall. Both of them are very tall. They may have no initial interest in basketball, but because they're tall, basketball coaches would approach them and say, well, have you ever thought of playing basketball? And that'll get them into the basketball circuit, and soon they might be in the NBA. As Flynn says it, there's a strong tendency for a genetic advantage, such as tallness, to get more and more matched to a corresponding environment. Flynn concluded that the environment plays a role in enhancing our cognitive powers. Now, we can further this goal through our own efforts, such as what we learn and what we do. For instance, we can increase our intelligence by solving math problems, interpreting literature, finding on-the-spot solutions to problems, assimilating the scientific worldview, and trying to practice some wisdom. Most important is seeking challenging cognitive environments. As an example, let me tell you about Rachel. When Rachel was born and tested later about age 7 or 8, she was found to have an average IQ. But she was born into a home where the parents provided intellectually stimulating experiences, such as books. And when she fell behind, she had tutors that helped her with those subjects. The parents remained involved in the school programs, but they were not over-involved with the school and the teachers. In other words, they weren't what we call helicopter parents. Now, thanks to these efforts, Rachel was accepted into a superior high school. Once there, she had to work harder, but she did well. She graduated in the top 20% of her class. As a result of that, she was accepted into a small, well-regarded university. While there, she met a teacher who inspired her to become a lawyer and to work hard and try to get into a law school, which she did. And after law school, she joined a firm specializing in intellectual property. While there, she met and married a colleague who combines his legal career with music and plays in a jazz group. Now, Rachel and her husband are involved in all sorts of cultural activities where they're living. So the bottom line is that Rachel's experiences have taken her further than her modest IQ would have predicted. Her environment outpaced her genetic inheritance as a determinant of her achievement. Now, what's going on in the brain that could account for such changes? As I mentioned in the last lecture, brain research was revolutionized by the discovery of what we call plasticity. And incidentally, when I say plasticity and talk about plasticity, I don't mean plastic bottles and things like that. There's a big difference between plastic and plasticity. By plasticity, I mean something that's malleable. Now, the science of plasticity and potential for growth is simply explained. When you exercise your brain, you release natural growth factors, like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. And you also influence neurotransmitters, which enhance your brain's level of performance. Plasticity refers to all the changes and all the things that can change in the structure and/or function of the brain, such as neurogenesis, which is the brain's ability to add new nerve cells. And that's a new concept, by the way. It used to be thought that there were never new nerve cells. Now we know that there are, at least in parts of the hippocampus. Secondly, there's increases in the efficiency of cell-to-cell communication via chemical messengers. Third, we have a remapping of the functional connections among neurons. As new things are learned, new maps are created or old maps are altered. Fourth, we have the establishment of alternative circuits to compensate for lost or injured areas. For instance, after a stroke, a person may not be able to move their right arm. Now, if you constrain that arm in a sling and force them to use their left hand and arm, you'll begin to get improvement. Now, much of what we learned about plasticity comes from animal research in enriched environments. William Greenough of the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana worked in the 1970s with two groups of rats. One group of rats was in what we would call lockdown. They were isolated, they didn't have any contact with other rats, had nothing stimulating, nothing happening all day long. The second group was in what Greenough called the rat equivalent of Disneyland. They had toys and wheels and other rats and interactions and things like that. They were more socially and physically active. The toys, brighter cages, networking, and coexisting with other rats. Now, under the microscope, was a 25% more synapses per neuron were found in that second group of the enriched rats. They had a greater brain volume, they had improved learning, and best of all, this correlation continued across their lifespan. Now, the take-home message is that if you want to make a rat grow up smarter, make its life more challenging, increase its opportunities for sensory stimulation and physical exercise and socialization. Each of these enhances the brain's development and leads to smarter rats. I have my own thoughts on the Greenough studies, as a matter of fact. Think about it for a moment. Even enriched rats in a lab are deprived compared to rats in the natural environment, which have to deal with predators and wander their way through very complicated mazes after food. So the enriched laboratory environment doesn't really nearly correspond to what the rat would find in the natural environment. So an enriched laboratory environment was what the study was about. The tantalizing question raised by this is, would an enriched environment in the real world lead to enhancement in the human brain? Let me tell you about the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. It compared abandoned children reared in institutions to abandoned children moved from the institutions to be raised in foster care. Their cognitive development was tracked through 54 months. The children who remained in the institutions remained far below the children removed to foster care. The younger the child when placed in foster care, the better the result. Now, this suggests a sensitive period during the first 2 years of life when the brain is especially vulnerable. Recall that, as we mentioned, the brain is plastic and will be shaped according to experience. If you enrich that experience, the brain thrives. Now, environmental enrichment is not limited to infancy. Let me tell you about a recent study on dyslexia. As you know, dyslexia has to do with difficulty in reading. And it's a lifetime problem, but it's not necessarily associated with IQ or achievement. My medical school roommate, for instance, was dyslexic and still graduated near the top of the class. Years later, on a book tour, I gave him a copy of one of my books, and he looked at it and smiled and said, "Thanks a lot, but you know I'll never read it." And he was making a point that dyslexics do not read for pleasure. They just read for practical reasons. Now, Marcel Just and Tim Keller of Carnegie Mellon carried out a research project involving dyslexic children between the ages of 8 and 10. They introduced a reading remediation program lasting only 6 months, but it led to an increase in white matter in the areas of the brain responsible for language. 37 poor readers received remedial instruction, while 12 did not. The white matter changes occurred only in the remedial group. Anatomical changes, incidentally, coincided with the improvements in reading. Now, this is what's called a brain-behavior correlation, a change in brain structure or function corresponding to a behavioral change. Now, the explanation for the dyslexia results are that repeated use of circuits stimulated oligodendrocytes to produce more myelin along the axons being fired. This increases the speed of conduction. Even modest modifications in white matter may enable major changes in cognitive ability, as Just and Keller claim and wrote in their Neuron paper. According to Dr. Just, the study provided evidence that repeated cognitive exercises can alter the connectivity of the human brain. Now, this course is based on that insight. In a later lecture, we will be talking about a form of repeated cognitive exercise called intensive deliberate practice. The main theme is that repeated cognitive exercises lead to mastery and to changes in the brain. For instance, intense piano practice increases white matter, but according to the intensity of the practice. A little bit of practice, a little bit of change. A lot of practice, a lot of change in the white matter. We deal here with a fundamental principle. We sculpt our brains according to our life experiences. And no two brains are alike, not even the brains of identical twins. And using imaging, you can even make inferences about a person based on his or her brain organization. A skilled pianist shows activation in the brain's finger areas while listening to music or watching someone else perform music. But he shows no response when watching random finger movements over a keyboard. A similar activation occurs in the relevant brain areas in ballet dancers and surgeons. We speak here of brain memory. You've often heard the word muscle memory, but it's not muscle memory, it's brain memory. Think of the human brain development as existing on a continuum across the lifespan. Brains of all ages share the same challenges: need for stimulation, the need to maintain nerve cell circuits despite a steady loss of neurons. There's also a striking paradox here that is worth mentioning, namely that improved function comes about with fewer components. So the brain is unlike any other biological or mechanical structure. Imagine buying a car that every 6 months you'd pull the hood up and you'd take a part out and it would run better, you get better mileage, better gas use and so forth. Well, that would be a very strange car. Yet the brain works that way. The maximum brain cell number is between 3 and 6 months of age. before we're even born. During the next 3 months, before birth and continuing during the first 2 years, the number of neurons decreases even more, while functional connections, or synapses, increase. Now, this corresponds to changes in the gray-white matter ratio. Think of the brain as being sculpted by experience. Now, keep in mind, an infant at birth has fewer neurons than during the latter part of gestation, but a far greater number than it will have as an adult. And we refer to this as pruning, and those of you that do gardening know what I mean by pruning. You go out and you cut off the branches that aren't healthy, and you just keep those that are viable. Now, circuits and networks, not nerve cell numbers, are the key to improved function. Learning is the means of establishing and maintaining these circuits. For instance, reading remediation is an example, as with the Just and Keller research I mentioned a moment ago. Think of brain circuits like friendships. Those that are maintained and enriched will endure. Those that are neglected will disappear. Maintenance, novelty, enriched experiences are like fertilizer on the brain, and they bring about growth and development. How do we know this? Here are some human examples of enriched experiences. Those of you that have been to London and taken cabs have seen that the London cab drivers really know the city. I mean, you tell them where you want to go and they don't have to consult anything, they take you right there. That's not just by accident. They've studied for 2 years all the streets of London, and they've taken a competitive test for it. Well, a study of the London cab drivers showed that they have a larger hippocampus with the size related to years of driving experience. So that's all encoded in this hippocampus. One wonders what the effect will be of a GPS, which probably at some point will be introduced. I speculate that there'll be a decrease in hippocampal size. A second study was of older adults who had learned to juggle 3 balls over 3 months. It showed an increased volume in the visual cortex, the hippocampus, and the nucleus accumbens. These changes disappeared 3 months after juggling stopped. A third example is a sighted person can be taught by wearing a blindfold or after 10 minutes of practice that he can acquire the skill of a person who is blind in the use of a cane. That's what's called an enlargement of peripersonal space. Now, that awareness disappears after only a few minutes when the blindfold is removed. Notice the short time span involved, only 10 minutes. We create new patterns of brain organization based on what we see, what we do, what we imagine, and what we learn. Learning something new establishes pathways consisting of millions of brain cells. Now, doing and not just observing is what's important. We have to activate what's called the action-observation network. Remember the experience of the ballet dancers I mentioned earlier? The development of the muscle memory, which is really brain memory. This is based on what's called the simulation hypothesis, the use of motor memory to interpret what other people are doing. Skilled athletes can do this all the time. They can watch and predict another athlete's performance. Boxers are particularly good at this. A professional boxer once told me he can see the punch coming before the person's going to throw it, even knows what they're going to do. Now, all of these examples are based on mirror neurons in the prefrontal cortex. These are clusters of cells originally observed in the macaque monkey. The cells respond when one monkey watches another one grasp a peanut. Now, these are the same cells that respond when the monkey grasps the peanut itself. Now, motor neurons are task-specific. They work according to what's called a perception-action matching system. If you watch me reach for a cup of tea, your brain becomes active in the same areas that are used when I'm reaching for that cup of tea. But if I reach for the teacup in another situation for another reason, such as cleaning up after a tea party, nothing happens. The mirror neurons are not activated. Now let's talk about the body image and its alterations. Now, what is a body image? Well, look at pictures of yourself or videos of yourself taken at different ages when you're 8 or 10 years of age. Your image of yourself and what your body was like is certainly different than it is now. It can be altered subtly. A new hairstyle or clothing outfit can also change your body image. The body image can also expand to include things that are external to ourselves. Parking space lines, for instance, look smaller to Hummer drivers compared to Prius drivers. The extension of body boundaries include attachment to electronic gadgets. You often notice that when you buy something electronic, it says that you have to have it repaired or replaced at the manufacturer's discretion. That's because we can become very attached. It could become part of our body image. We're also aware of things like "you're in my space," feeling that our body boundary is being violated. One driver is cut off, for instance, on the road and sets off an episode of road rage because the other driver feels that their body image and body space has been invaded. Great cultural differences exist concerning how close other people should be, lest they become offensive. Let's talk about learning. Think of the branching of a tree. In full bloom, the tree gives off branches, twigs, leaves, and blossoms. Similarly, learning leads to fuller and richer circuits. If learning stops, the brain reverts to a state similar to the tree in winter: bare branches, no leaves, stark and skeletal. Remember, learning is specific. A ballet dancer's brain responds when watching other ballet dancers, but does not respond to ballroom dancers. We sculpt our brain and our learning by our specific experiences. Surgeons have greater activation in the hand areas of the brain compared to non-surgeons. Perhaps that's why many retired surgeons take up hobbies related to finger agility, such as cut glass and ceramics. All these professions have shaped their brains by virtue of their experience. Technology can also bring about changes in the brain thanks to plasticity. Our widespread use of internet-based technologies leads to changes in our thinking patterns, like scanning and skimming and idea shopping and browsing and multitasking. In the lecture on technology, we will examine in more detail the effect of technology on our cognition, including why technology rather than biology will determine future brain development. In fact, it already has. The thinking patterns of the web generation differ from the traditional ways of obtaining information. The last part of this lecture, I want to suggest some plasticity-enhancing exercises. We'll start with elementary physical sensations because we often pay insufficient attention to what our senses are telling us. This leads to failures of memory. We can't remember what we never registered. We're going to talk about 3 exercises: visual and auditory, sensory and motor exercises involving hand dexterity, and peripersonal space exercises. First, visual exercises. Actors have always used sense memory exercises. A traditional one is the use of a coffee cup, an empty coffee cup. You hold one, you recognize its height, its color, composition, the ridges on the lips, artwork, designs, and you're memorizing this. Light reflections from it. When you're finished looking at it, you involve your other senses. How does it feel? What sound does it make when you flick it on the edge? How heavy is it? The goal is to recreate the cup in your brain. The same brain circuits are involved, incidentally, as when dealing with or exploring the real cup. An actor can make an audience see a cup that he's not actually holding because of this ability to actually make everything look just right, like he's holding the cup. Now, you take any object that interests you, doesn't have to be a coffee cup, and recreate it via a similar exercise. Now, sound exercises involve paying attention to the sounds around you. Here's an example. In the 1950s, Jack Foley, a film editor at Universal Pictures, came up with the idea of assembling a studio where he could create live sound effects for movies by using simple and readily available sources. Now, this required a sharp ear for sounds. For instance, crumpling a newspaper sounds like fire. Try it for yourself. Close your eyes, get a newspaper, roll it up and put it to your ear and crumple it. Sounds just like a fire. Foley artists, of course, need a sharp ear for the sounds of everyday objects to create their special effects. For instance, the laser blasts in Star Wars were made by taking a hammer and hitting a high-tension wire that supports an antenna. Stabbing a body is essentially like the sound of a knife stabbing a watermelon. The sound of bone crushing can be made by crunching celery. So as a sound exercise, listen to the things around you in order to sharpen your sensitivity. Try to figure out what sounds might be substituted for others. You can also use classical music, compare composers, performers, and performances. Or take your own special interests. Some people are interested in the sounds of certain birds and correlating them with pictures or seeing the birds. In one personal example, in my home in Prince Edward Island in the summer, there's a lot of frogs, and I've sort of come to recognize the call of different frogs from listening to them and listening to recordings. There's another area of listening that's important, and that's for emotions in human voices. The human voice has a lot of leakage of emotions because of changes in tone, cadence, loudness, and pacing. Exercises involving the hand are functionally related to the brain. It's very important. A large area of the brain is showing the hand, is correlated with the hand. Developing nimble fingers is a surefire way of improving brain function. Take up juggling or a hobby that requires fine detail work like knitting, painting, drawing, manipulating, or penmanship. I have a great interest in pens because I try to improve my cursive writing. Exercises of what we call peripersonal space have to do with that virtual envelope around the skin surface that extends our body boundaries. For instance, try this exercise. Just take your fingers, move them forward so that they touch, and it's not very hard to do, is it? But try it with your eyes closed, and you'll find that it's actually difficult to do because we don't really have much experience doing it. Another thing is to pretend that you've got a gun and pointing it at your toe. No problem as long as your eyes are open, but when you do it with your eyes closed, you're not able to do it as well. You're not initially able to do well because of your brain's over-reliance on vision. So take up a sport that demands an awareness of your body boundaries and extensions. Tennis is a good example. You have to know where your arm is, where you're standing, you have to know about the ball, you have to be able to just correlate exactly where you're going to place it so it's just within the court and not outside in an illegal shot. If you do this, you'll achieve what we call enhanced kinesthetic sense. Now, kinesthetic sense exercises are performed all the time by musicians and athletes. What they're working toward is making up what we call embodied knowledge, to be able to take what they've learned and be able to make it almost automatic. It becomes part of the body image that we've been talking about. Now, I think the very best is Tai Chi. I've done this for years, and Tai Chi, you learn this complicated form. It takes a while to learn it, but it's worth doing. And after that, you're able to sort of realize where parts of your body are when you're making a certain movement. And a good teacher will ask you to close your eyes and imagine where your arm is, and then you imagine it, and then you look and you see that it takes a while to develop the ability to know exactly where your hand and arm is. Now, in the lecture on sensory memory, I will describe additional exercises involving touch and the special senses of taste and smell. So in this lecture, we've talked about two main points. Your brain and your intelligence can change throughout your lifespan. And most importantly, you are able to shape these changes in your own brain. Now, in the next lecture, we'll move from plasticity to the importance for brain health of what you eat, how you exercise, and how well you sleep. We'll talk about that next time.